Before we jump into today's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button. You won't want to miss what comes next. And if you enjoy powerful emotional journeys, check out the other videos on the channel and share this one with someone who loves a good story. Now let's begin. In the years before everything collapsed, Caitlyn Reeves had lived a life that felt as though it had been assembled with careful hands, each piece chosen to fit perfectly into an image she had spent so long constructing that she often forgot it was just that, an image. Her design studio in Portland was small, but known for its impeccable taste, the kind of place where boutique hotels and trendy restaurants came for branding that made people stop and look twice. It had taken her more than a decade to build it into something respected, and she carried that respect around like an invisible badge pinned to her chest. She had grown used to hearing her name spoken with admiration at local business events, used to the calm sense of pride that came from being introduced as the woman behind some of the city's most recognizable interiors. From the outside, her life looked orderly and purposeful. She woke early, often before dawn, and reviewed mood boards over her first cup of coffee. Her days were filled with client meetings, color swatches, sketches scattered across large wooden desks, and the comforting buzz of collaboration inside the industrial loft she'd converted into her office. When evening came, she often walked home through the crisp air of the Maine coastline, where her husband would be waiting in their well-kept house in the suburbs. It was a home that reflected her aesthetic: two clean lines, soft lighting, curated decorations, a place that looked like it belonged in a magazine feature, and once or twice actually had. Her husband admired her precision, though sometimes he joked that she was married more to her work than to him. But he benefited from the glow of her success, the dinners with clients, the sense that they were going somewhere together, building something lasting. And Caitlyn believed it too. She believed in the trajectory she had created, in the idea that hard work, discipline, and a talent for beauty would always carry her forward. There had been no reason back then for her to doubt any of it. When the hotel group approached her with the biggest contract of her career, she saw it as the next natural step. It was a chain planning to renovate and reopen several boutique lodgings across New England, places with history, charm, and enough quirks to make a designer salivate at the creative possibilities. The investor behind the chain had seemed steady and smooth in his confidence when they'd met, promising staggered payments, creative freedom, and a long-term relationship that could elevate her studio to national recognition. It was everything she had ever said she wanted, everything she had worked so long to deserve. She took the risk without hesitation, hired extra freelancers, ordered supplies, paid for mock-ups and prototypes, expanded her office for the larger team she expected to keep. Her bank extended her a generous line of credit based on projected revenue, and although the numbers made her uneasy at first, she convinced herself that this was simply what growth required. Her husband echoed the same optimism at first, proud of her ambition, flattered by the opportunities it opened for them both. But then the payments slowed, first by a few days, then by weeks. Excuses came from the investor through polished emails and uneasy phone calls, delays in accounting, temporary issues, shifting priorities. She clung to his reassurances, partly because she wanted to believe him, but mostly because she could not afford not to. She had poured everything into the project already. She needed it to stabilize her business, her finances, her life. She needed it to keep the story of Caitlyn Reeves, successful designer, smart business owner, capable woman, intact. The moment she realized the investor was gone for good was not dramatic. There was no final phone call, no explosive confrontation. One morning she simply awoke, checked her inbox, and felt her chest tighten when she saw nothing. No payments, no messages, not even one of his typical vague reassurances. His website was offline, his number redirected endlessly. She later learned he had vanished under a storm of lawsuits, accusations, and debts of his own. But by then it didn't matter. The damage was already done. Her studio fell apart faster than she had ever imagined possible. The freelancers demanded pay she could not give. Suppliers filed claims. The bank withdrew its leniency and demanded repayment on loans she had assumed she would manage easily once the project launched. Her husband grew increasingly anxious, insisting she should have seen the signs, that she should have slowed down, taken precautions, listened to him more. They fought about money, then about trust, then about the future they had once planned in detail, but which now seemed laughably out of reach. Caitlyn tried to save what she could. Hours with lawyers blur into each other in her memory stacks of papers, cold conference rooms, the stale smell of stale coffee in desperation. She tried to negotiate with creditors, tried to sell smaller projects, tried to convince herself that things would stabilize if she just worked harder, slept less, pushed through. But the avalanche had already started, and the sound of it filled her ears every waking moment. Her husband left in early winter. It was not explosive, not even dramatic. A quiet conversation in a kitchen that no longer felt like home. A duffel bag by the door. A weary look, less angry than simply done. He said he needed space, needed stability, needed something she no longer seemed able to give. She said little in response, too numb to argue, too exhausted to fight. The house followed him out of her life soon after. Foreclosure papers arrived with the cold efficiency of bureaucracy, and Caitlyn watched as the place she had once decorated with such pride emptied room by room. She walked through the bare living room on the last day, her hand brushing the outline of a picture that had hung there for years, and she felt a kind of hollowness she could not put words to. It was as though she were leaving behind not just a house, but a version of herself she no longer recognized. When the last payment was made and the last bag packed, she found herself in an old SUV with only what she could salvage. A few tools, some clothes, a battered box of project sketches she couldn't bear to discard, and her dog, Atlas. A border collie with patient eyes, he watched her with a calm, steady presence that anchored her in ways she didn't fully understand. Everything else, her studio, her marriage, her name in the community, was gone. The days that followed were a blur of motion. Parking lots behind grocery stores, truck stops, dim motel rooms paid by the night. She lived from one cheap meal to another, her world shrinking to the inside of her car and the uneven rhythm of her own thoughts. Shame wrapped around her like a tightening rope each time she saw people going about their lives, oblivious to the quiet collapse happening behind her still exterior. Through all of it, Atlas stayed by her side. He adapted to the cramped back seat, curled beside her on cold nights, nudged her awake when her mind spiraled too far into despair. She had always loved him, but now his existence felt vital, like the last small beam holding up a roof after the foundation had already given way. It was during one of these bleak nights that she remembered something her aunt had once told her, stories about forgotten ranger cabins deep in the White Mountains. Her aunt had worked for the National Forest Service decades ago and often spoke of remote shelters once used by forest rangers, long since abandoned as newer systems took their place. Some still stood, scattered across the wilderness like relics of a quieter time, left to the mercy of snow and wind. The memory struck Caitlyn with unexpected force, a place where no one cared who you used to be, a place where silence didn't need to be filled with shame. It sounded impossible, and yet the thought planted itself firmly in her mind, refusing to leave. She began searching through online forums, old maps, archived ranger logs accessible through local libraries, piecing together scraps of information until a pattern began to emerge. There was mention of a cabin in a remote corner of the forest, one that had once served as part of a monitoring station, but had been decommissioned decades before. Its exact coordinates were unclear, but the descriptions were consistent enough for her to believe it was still there. The realization that she could simply leave not just the city, but the entire structure of her failed life, pulled her forward like a tide. She gathered what little she had left, filled the SUV with enough canned food, blankets and tools to attempt something resembling survival, and turned north toward the mountains. The farther she drove from Portland, the lighter she felt and the heavier the landscape became. Houses thinned and trees multiplied. Gas stations became rarer and cell service flickered in and out. Eventually, even paved roads gave way to dirt and gravel, her tires crunching over frost-hardened ground. The forest rose around her in dark columns, ancient and impassive, as though it were a world separate from human concerns. By the time she reached the unmarked turnoff that her research suggested would lead to the abandoned cabin, the sun was sinking behind the ridge, painting the sky with cold streaks of fading orange. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel, feeling both fear and something startlingly close to relief. There was no one here who knew her failures, no one to remind her of what she had lost. Only the long stretch of forest road ahead and the possibility, fragile and strange, of being able to start again. She followed the crude path deeper into the woods, the SUV lurching and rattling over roots and rocks. Branches scraped the sides of the vehicle like skeletal fingers, and for a long moment she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But Atlas rested his head between the front seats, watching her calmly, and she forced herself to continue. Eventually the path widened into a small clearing, and there it stood, the ranger cabin. Dark, weather-beaten, listing slightly to one side, but still standing as if it had been waiting for her all this time. Caitlyn stopped the engine and sat in silence, listening to the ticking of cooling metal and the deep hush of the surrounding forest. Then she took a breath that felt like the first full breath she'd had in months. She had reached the end of her old life, and perhaps, without fully understanding it yet, the beginning of a new one. The clearing seemed almost unreal in the fading twilight, as if the forest had opened just long enough to reveal a secret before closing again. The old ranger cabin stood with the stubbornness of something that refused to surrender to time, its roof sagging slightly, its windows gaping dark and empty, but the silhouette held steady against the expanse of trees rising behind it. Caitlyn sat for several minutes inside the idling SUV, her hands still gripping the steering wheel long after the engine had quieted. The silence around her was so complete it felt like stepping into another world, one that had existed parallel to her life, but untouched by all the noise that had filled it for so long. Atlas was the first to move. He pushed his nose into her shoulder, eager to leave the confines of the car, and his impatient shift of weight made the vehicle rock slightly. Caitlyn let out a shaky breath and reached for the door handle. As she stepped into the crisp mountain air, the cold bit at her exposed skin, but it felt strangely invigorating. She inhaled deeply, tasting pine and frost, and wondered how something so sharp could feel like the beginning of relief. The cabin up close was even more worn than it had seemed from the car. One side of the porch had collapsed inward, the boards splintered and bleached by seasons of snow and rain. The windows, or what remained of them, had long since lost their glass, leaving only empty frames with jagged shards of wood. Moss crept along the lower logs like a soft, green veil. Yet beneath the decay, Caitlyn sensed a kind of resilience, as though the place had weathered storms far worse than anything she could imagine. It felt battered, yes, but not defeated. She clicked on her flashlight and stepped carefully across the porch, testing each board before putting her weight on it. Atlas trotted ahead, nose twitching as he investigated every crack and corner. The door resisted when she pushed it, swollen in its frame, but after a firm shove, it gave way with a low groan. A heavy scent flooded out, musty, damp, layered with the long-neglected smell of old wood, dust, and something that reminded her faintly of the forgotten attic in her childhood home. Inside, darkness swallowed the beam of her flashlight, except where it brushed across the room, revealing fragments of what had once been functional space. An old table slumped against one wall, one of its legs broken. The remnants of a metal cot lay rusted in another corner. A few hooks still hung from the beams overhead, and the floor, though uneven and scattered with debris, appeared mostly intact. A shaft of moonlight filtered through a hole in the roof, illuminating the center of the room in a soft, silver glow. She stepped fully inside and felt an unexpected wave of emotion rise in her chest. It was not fear, though fear was certainly there, quiet and humming. It was not even sadness. It was something closer to recognition, as if she and this cabin shared a certain brokenness, neither destroyed exactly, but stripped down to the raw essentials. She set her bag on the floor and stood still for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. Atlas paced around the cabin, tail high, as though approving the space. Maybe he sensed nothing threatening here. Maybe he simply recognized her need for something solid, even if that solid thing was decayed and fragile. The first night was clumsy and uncomfortable. She had brought a sleeping bag, but the floor felt unforgiving, every shift of weight sending a new ache through her body. The temperature dropped quickly, the cold seeping into her bones despite her layered clothing. Wind whispered through cracks in the walls, and branches tapped the exterior in irregular rhythms that made drifting off almost impossible. Atlas curled against her side, his warmth the only steady comfort. She slept in brief intervals, each time waking with a start, disoriented by the unfamiliar darkness. When morning came, sunlight streamed through the gaps in the roof and walls, revealing the full extent of the damage. Without the softness of night, the cabin's wear appeared stark. Mold on the planks, dark stains on the floor, a roof on the verge of collapsing in several places. Yet the morning light also offered clarity, a renewed sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She stood in the doorway with a cup of instant coffee and considered the structure carefully, her mind shifting back into the problem-solving mode that had once come so naturally to her. The first task was obvious: the roof. If she couldn't stop the leaks and prevent the worst drafts, nothing else mattered. She spent the morning clearing debris, dragging rotting boards outside and taking inventory of what remained usable. Her hands stiffened in the cold, and splinters pricked her skin, but she worked steadily, methodically, almost gratefully. There was something deeply grounding in the physical effort, something she hadn't realized she missed until she felt it again. It was work without clients, without deadlines, without anyone waiting to critique or approve it. The cabin didn't care about her reputation or her failures. It simply needed to be fixed, and for once she had the power and the skill to do something tangible. Atlas stayed nearby, sometimes watching her, sometimes wandering small distances into the trees before returning with a soft bark, as if checking to make sure she hadn't vanished. His presence kept her tethered, a reminder that she wasn't truly alone, even in this remote wilderness. The first few days blurred together in a rhythm of labor and discovery. Each morning she woke sore but determined, and each evening she collapsed into her sleeping bag exhausted, her mind finally too tired to spiral into old anxieties. Repairing the roof took longer than she expected, especially with the limited materials she had brought, but she managed to patch the worst of the gaps with tarps, spare planks, and rope. It was temporary, crude, but effective enough to keep out the light snow that began falling at the end of the week. Once the roof was stable, she turned to the walls. Many of the gaps between the logs were wide enough for wind to whistle through freely, which made the cabin cold even during mild days. She gathered moss from the forest floor, thick and pliable, and used it to fill the cracks, pressing it into place the way early settlers once had. The work was repetitive, almost meditative. The forest was quiet enough that she could hear her own breathing, the rustle of moss, the occasional snap of a twig under Atlas's paws. Inside, she organized her belongings with a practicality born from necessity. Tools along one wall, food stored in sealed containers raised off the floor, clothing folded neatly into a corner where leaks were least likely. She cleared space for a small portable stove and practiced using it safely, paying careful attention to ventilation. Everything she did had to be deliberate, because mistakes here were not mild inconveniences, they were risks. The forest around her revealed its presence in unexpected ways. Some mornings she found fresh tracks in the soft earth near the cabin, silhouettes of animals moving in the night, the delicate hooves of deer, the long prints of foxes, and once larger impressions that made her pause, heart quickening. A bear, perhaps. Atlas had sensed it before she had, growling softly at the door in the darkness that night. She'd kept him close, whispering reassurances into his fur even as she felt far from reassured herself. She learned quickly that food had to be protected. One evening she returned from gathering wood to find that some curious creature had nosed through her supplies, not breaking the containers, but scattering what it could. It was a small incident, but enough to teach her caution. She built a makeshift storage shelf, high and sturdy, and kept anything scented locked away. The animals here followed their own patterns, indifferent to her survival, but eager for opportunities. The days grew shorter as fall crept toward winter. The sunlight filtered through the trees in colder hues, and frost began to cling to the ground each morning. Caitlyn found herself relying more and more on firewood, which meant regular trips into the surrounding woods, learning to identify deadfall suitable for burning. She learned which areas became slippery after rain, where the ground dipped unexpectedly, how sound traveled differently depending on the direction of the wind. The forest slowly became a map she could read, not perfectly, but well enough to navigate with growing confidence. Emotionally, the transition was harder to navigate. There were days when she felt strong enough to tackle anything, days when she looked around at the work she had accomplished and felt something like pride flicker inside her. But there were also days when a distant memory, a moment from her marriage, or the image of her old studio, or the sound of her name spoken in admiration, brought a hollow ache that left her breathless. She missed things she didn't want to miss, conversations she used to take for granted, the idea of being someone who had certainty. It struck her that solitude was not a single emotion, but a shifting landscape with its own storms and calms. Yet the longer she stayed, the more she sensed something changing inside her. The forest was stripping away the noise, leaving her with raw truths she had avoided for so long. She found herself thinking not about the trappings of her past success, but about who she had been beneath them. A woman who had once been curious, a woman who used her hands creatively before business thrust her behind screens and schedules. A woman who used to walk in silence just to feel connected to something larger than herself. Bit by bit, she was relearning how to exist without an audience. Winter arrived suddenly one evening with a storm that battered the cabin until it shuddered. Caitlyn had only just finished reinforcing the roof enough to trust it would hold. She spent the night listening to the wind howl through the trees, imagining the cabin's history, how many storms it must have endured long before she ever existed. Atlas lay pressed against her, wide awake and alert, his breath warm against her side. She felt less afraid than she expected. Not because she was prepared for every possibility she knew she wasn't, but because for the first time in a long time, she felt anchored to the present moment, rather than trapped in regrets or fears. As the storm subsided, she stepped outside at dawn to find the world transformed. Everything was coated in white. The trees bowed under the weight of heavy snow. Her breath formed soft clouds in the air as she surveyed the clearing. It looked both harsh and beautiful, a reminder of how fragile and resilient life could be in the same breath. She realized then that she had crossed an invisible line. She had come here running from the ruins of her life, but now she was no longer simply hiding. She was building something, even if she didn't yet understand what. The cabin stood because she had willed it to stand. She stood because she refused to fall any further. And as winter settled fully around the clearing, she discovered she was ready to face whatever came next. Winter wrapped itself around the mountains with a quiet determination that left no room for hesitation. By the time the last of the autumn color faded from the trees and the ground hardened beneath a thin, persistent crust of frost, Caitlyn understood that the season had not simply arrived, it had claimed the land entirely. She woke each morning to a cold so penetrating it seemed to seep into her thoughts before she even opened her eyes, and every movement required a focus she had never needed in her former life. Yet she found a strange solace in the rigor of it, as though winter itself was instructing her on how to strip life down to its most essential truths. The cabin, despite her efforts, was still a fragile shelter. The roof groaned with each new snowfall, and though she had sealed the worst gaps, the wind still found its way through the walls, weaving icy fingers into the room at night. She slept in layers curled tightly inside her sleeping bag, with Atlas pressed against her side for warmth. He had always been a devoted companion, but here in the mountains he became something more, a sentinel of the quiet nights, a guide to the unspoken rhythms of the wilderness. When he stirred at some distant sound, she woke instantly. When he relaxed, she dared to breathe more deeply. The first weeks of winter were a slow descent into isolation. The road she had come by disappeared beneath snowdrifts that grew deeper with every storm. At first she thought she might clear it with enough effort, but one attempt taught her the futility of the idea. The path was too long, the snow too heavy, and she was only one person with nothing but a shovel and her own endurance. Accepting that she was truly cut off brought a moment of fear so acute she had to sit down to steady her breath. But after the fear came an unexpected calm. The world outside the clearing fell silent, not just physically, but in her mind as well. There were no calls, no bills, no deadlines, no reminders of who she had once been. Just the cold, the cabin, and the comfortingly predictable pattern of the days. She focused on firewood as it quickly became the center of her existence. The small stove she had salvaged was efficient but demanding, burning through logs at a pace that forced her outside several times a day. She learned to assess the woodpile not with casual awareness, but with a near-constant vigilance, calculating how many hours each stack represented. She dragged fallen branches from deeper in the forest, split them with a rhythmic, repetitive force that numbed her mind and warmed her body, then stacked them neatly as though each log carried a promise of warmth she could hold on to. The work was taxing, and every evening she collapsed into her makeshift bed, muscles aching and hands raw. But the tiredness felt clean, unlike the exhaustion she remembered from her days in the city. That had been a kind of mental drowning. Too many emails, too many doubts, too many expectations crushing down at once. This was different. Her body hurt because she had done something real, something necessary, and the simplicity of that truth brought her more peace than she had felt in years. Yet winter also carried moments of stark vulnerability. One night, after a particularly fierce snowfall, she woke to the sensation of cold air pressing against her face more sharply than usual. It took her a moment to understand. The stove had nearly gone out. She scrambled to feed it new logs, her breath catching as she coaxed the embers back to life. The room warmed slowly again, but the fear lingered. If she had slept through that moment, the consequences could have been dire. She stayed awake until dawn, listening to the shifting sounds of the cabin and forcing herself not to imagine all the ways the winter could take control if she let her guard drop. Atlas sensed her anxiety, lifting his head and placing it gently in her lap, as if reminding her that she was not facing the season alone. She stroked his fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, and whispered reassurances she wasn't sure she believed. But the act of speaking them out loud made the long night feel less endless. Days passed in a rhythm she gradually learned to trust. She woke at the first hint of light, fed the stove, checked the roof for new leaks, brushed snow off the makeshift tarp coverings. She boiled water from melted snow, portioned out her food carefully, and kept a mental record of how long her supplies would last. There was comfort in the repetition, in the way it kept her from spiraling into memories or regrets. She no longer had the luxury of dwelling on past failures. Survival didn't leave room for rumination. Still, the silence pressed against her in ways she had not anticipated. In her old life, even the quiet moments were saturated with background noise traffic, voices, the hum of electronics. Here, the silence was total, vast, almost sentient. It felt like another presence in the cabin, observing her, waiting for her to learn how to inhabit it without fear. There were nights when she lay awake for hours, listening to the distant crack of ice or the moaning wind through the trees, and felt the weight of solitude settle over her like a second blanket. Sometimes it comforted her. Sometimes it felt unbearably heavy. It was during one of these nights, her thoughts restless and her hands cold despite the fire's glow, that she reached for the small notebook she kept near her bed. She had brought it without much thought, imagining she might use it for grocery lists or reminders. Instead, she found herself writing down details of her days, how many logs she'd split, how much snow she'd melted, how long the firewood lasted. At first, the entries were purely factual, practical, but as the nights grew longer and the silence deeper, her writing shifted. She scribbled down observations about the way frost gathered at the doorframe, about Atlas's changing behavior, about the odd comfort she found in watching the snow fall endlessly. She reflected on her life in Portland, not with the sharp pain of regret, but with a quieter, more distant curiosity, as though she were studying a life that no longer belonged to her. The notebook became a lifeline. Writing gave structure to days that might otherwise blur together and helped her make sense of the subtle changes happening inside her. She wrote about how the forest forced her to slow down, how the simple act of making a fire each morning felt like reclaiming a part of herself she had neglected for years. She wrote about loneliness, acknowledging it without letting it control her. She wrote about fear, naming it so it would lose some of its power. And she wrote about small, unexpected joys, the crisp beauty of a sunrise, the warmth of Atlas's body next to hers, the satisfaction of repairing something with her hands. As the heavy grip of winter deepened, the world outside the cabin changed quietly but steadily. Snow accumulated on the branches until they sagged under the weight, and the creek near the clearing froze into a glittering ribbon. Animal tracks appeared and disappeared in the snow each morning, leaving delicate patterns she struggled to identify. On milder days, she ventured further into the woods, learning the contours of the land, mapping out areas where wood was plentiful or where the wind seemed to gather most fiercely. Each outing made her feel more like a part of the forest rather than a visitor clinging to its edges. The turning point came in late winter, after a storm that left the cabin buried in snow up to the windowsills. For 3 days, she barely stepped outside, surviving on what she had already prepared and finding herself slipping into an almost trance-like stillness. On the 4th morning, when the snow finally stopped, she pushed her way out onto the porch, breath steaming in the cold air, and saw a landscape transformed. The entire world was white and shimmering, a soft, endless expanse of silence. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, the sun weak but bright enough to glow faintly against the snow. And in that moment, something inside her shifted. She was no longer thinking about the life she had lost. She was contemplating a life she had not yet fully begun. That was when the idea of documenting her experiences grew into something larger. Her notebook entries expanded from personal reflections into detailed explanations of how she solved specific problems, how she fixed the roof, how she insulated the walls, how she learned to ration her supplies. She wrote about the psychological challenges of isolation, about the necessity of routine, about the strange process of relearning how to be comfortable in her own mind. She found herself describing not only what she had done, but why it mattered. The notebook became not just a record, but a guide, one she imagined someone else might read one day and learn from. When spring finally began to make itself known, it did so tentatively, almost shyly. The first sign was the sound of water trickling beneath the snow, faint but unmistakable. Then the air warmed enough during the day for the snow to soften, and the trees shed their icy coats in slow dripping rhythms. Patches of earth emerged like secrets being revealed. Atlas grew more energetic, sensing the world waking up around them, and Caitlyn felt the same stirring inside herself. She stepped outside more often, breathing deeply, savoring the scent of thawing soil and new beginnings. The forest changed rapidly after that. Green crept across the landscape, tentative at first, then bold, reclaiming everything winter had buried. Birds returned, filling the air with chatter that felt almost chaotic after months of silence. Caitlyn walked the trails she had beaten down through the snow and found them now softened by mud and littered with new growth. She moved slowly, absorbing the shift in the world, recognizing that she too was shifting. It was on one of these walks that she encountered the first travelers. She had ventured halfway toward a ridge that offered a view of the valley when she heard voices distant, unfamiliar, and startling in their sudden intrusion into the quiet she had grown accustomed to. She froze, Atlas standing alert beside her, ears perked. Then the voices grew louder, accompanied by the crunch of boots on damp earth, and a moment later a pair of hikers emerged from the trees. They stopped when they saw her, equally surprised. The man lifted a hand in greeting. The woman smiled in that tentative way people do when encountering strangers in remote places. They asked if she lived nearby, clearly expecting her to say she was on a camping trip. When she told them she lived in the old ranger cabin, their expressions shifted from polite curiosity to genuine fascination. Questions followed: how she managed, why she chose to stay, what the winter had been like. They were impressed, even a little awed, and Caitlyn struggled to respond without feeling embarrassed. She wasn't a hero. She wasn't even sure she was entirely stable. She was simply surviving. But as she spoke, she noticed something in their eyes, something like longing. They listened not just with interest, but with recognition, as though her story reflected something they themselves feared or desired. When they left, they thanked her for sharing and wished her well with an earnestness she hadn't expected. The encounter stayed with her long after she walked back to the cabin. She realized that the hikers had looked at her not with pity, but with admiration. They had heard her story as one of courage, not collapse. It made her think about the way she had framed her own life for so long as a string of failures, missteps, and losses. But here in the forest, Her story seemed to hold a different shape, one she had not allowed herself to see. More travelers came as spring turned to early summer. Not many, this was still a remote corner of the White Mountains, but enough that she began to see a pattern. Each person she met carried some burden of their own, a marriage dissolving, a job lost, a dream deferred. When she spoke to them about her time in the cabin, about the challenges and the strange joys, she saw the same look in their faces: hope, possibility, relief at hearing that someone else had unraveled and rebuilt themselves in a different form. Gradually, almost without realizing it, she began to hope too. She returned to her notebook with new purpose, filling page after page with reflections, observations, practical advice, and the quiet revelations the wilderness had offered her. She found herself imagining a different kind of life than the one she had once clung to. A life where she wasn't defined by her past mistakes, where she didn't need to measure her worth by productivity or praise. A life where she could help others find their own kind of peace in the wilderness. The idea for something larger took root in her mind and refused to let go. What if she could create a space here, temporary, structured, but deeply empathetic for people who, like her, needed to step away from the world in order to rediscover themselves? What if the cabin, once a forgotten piece of history, could become the center of something new? Not a business in the traditional sense, but a sanctuary, a place where people came not to escape, but to recalibrate. The thought sent a thrill through her, fragile but unmistakable. It was the first time in years that she allowed herself to imagine a future shaped not by fear, but by purpose. She had survived the winter. She had learned to live with the silence. She had rewritten pieces of herself she once thought were lost forever. Now she wondered what else might be possible. The forest had given her room to breathe, to break, to begin again, and Caitlyn realized she wanted to give that gift to others. She was no longer running from her past. She was walking, slowly but deliberately, towards something new. The idea that had begun as a quiet whisper during the thaw of spring settled into Caitlyn's thoughts with increasing clarity as the months unfolded. It grew gradually, the way a seedling presses through soil, fragile at first, but undeniably alive. She found herself imagining not just what she could build for her own survival, but what she could create for others who felt unsteady in their own lives, those who were lost in the noise of modern routines or crushed under expectations that no longer fit. The forest had given her a sense of grounding she had not felt in years, and though she still didn't fully understand why her life had needed to break so completely before finding this strange stillness, she felt a responsibility to share what she had learned. As the air warmed and the last traces of winter loosened their grip, the clearing around the cabin revealed itself in ways she had not seen before. Fresh green shoots pushed up near the tree line, wildflowers peppered the grass with bursts of color, and birds returned with a lively presence that filled the quiet mornings. For the first time since she had arrived, Caitlyn felt what could only be described as hope. It didn't come in some dramatic revelation, but in the steady unfolding of days that no longer blurred into survival alone. She found herself waking without dread, stepping outside simply because the sun was rising, and she wanted to witness it. Atlas seemed to sense the shift in her, matching her mood with an increased brightness, his steps lighter, his gaze more curious as they ventured farther from the cabin. It was during a late afternoon walk, as they crested a small ridge overlooking the valley below, that her thoughts took on a new kind of direction. The trail she had beaten during winter was now soft with thawing earth and dappled sunlight, and the world stretched out in a way that made her past life seem impossibly distant. She sat on a fallen log, Atlas lying at her feet, and reopened the notebook that had become her closest companion during the coldest months. Turning through its pages, she was struck by how much her own handwriting had changed. Early entries, tight and desperate. Later ones, steadier, fuller, no longer frantic. She realized that the notebook had ceased being merely a record of survival. It had become a testament to transformation. People needed this, she thought. Not the hardship exactly. She would never wish the deepest moments of that winter on anyone. But they needed the space to hear themselves again, to strip away everything that drowned out their own instincts. They needed a pause from the world, the same pause she had so reluctantly embraced. The hikers she had spoken with had shown her that she was not alone in that longing, and their expressions had stayed with her, rooting themselves in her thoughts until they formed the foundation of a new idea, a retreat. Not a resort, not a trendy escape marketed to overworked professionals, but a place steeped in honesty where people could learn practical skills, reconnect with quieter rhythms, and confront truths without distraction. Once the idea solidified, she could not ignore it. It pulled at her thoughts as persistently as hunger, urging her to consider the practicalities. She needed more space, more structures, and most dauntingly official permission. The land belonged to the National Forest Service, after all, and while the cabin had stood neglected for decades, any modifications beyond its immediate footprint required approval. The realization filled her with a familiar apprehension, the kind she used to feel before difficult client meetings or high-stakes presentations. But she also knew she was not the same person who had once navigated those corridors of expectation. She had survived winter here. Surely she could survive whatever bureaucracy came next. In early summer, after making a careful list of everything she would need to address, she packed a small bag, secured the cabin, and began the long walk down the mountain to where she had left her SUV months earlier. The road had cleared by then, though parts of it remained muddy and uneven. The drive to town felt surreal, as though she were revisiting a world that no longer belonged to her. The stores, the chatter of people, the bright advertisements in windows, all of it seemed louder than she remembered, too fast, too insistent. Atlas stayed close, unnerved by the sudden shift. At the regional ranger station, she spoke with a man whose badge identified him as a supervisory officer. He listened attentively as she explained her idea, her reasoning, and her desire to remain respectful to the land. When she finished, he leaned back, studying her with an expression that was hard to interpret. She braced herself for dismissal, expecting him to tell her the project was too complicated, too impractical, too unprecedented. Instead, he surprised her. "You're not the first person to try living up there," he said, his tone thoughtful rather than skeptical. "But you might be the first one who's handled it responsibly." He asked questions, many of them, and she answered each as clearly as she could. He took notes, nodded occasionally, and when she was finished, he explained the process. Environmental assessments, structural evaluations, written proposals, adherence to low-impact building standards. It sounded overwhelming, but also manageable, especially compared to the seemingly infinite demands of her past projects. This was not a world built on corporate competition or abstract expectations. It was grounded, practical, tied to something larger than personal ambition. She spent the next several months traveling back and forth between the cabin and the nearest town, completing forms, drafting plans, and sometimes meeting with officials on site so they could assess the feasibility of her proposal. One woman, a ranger with decades of experience, accompanied her to the clearing and inspected the land. The woman moved with a reverence that reminded Caitlyn of her aunt's slow, deliberate steps, eyes always scanning the details of the environment. "This place has history," the ranger said softly, "and it deserves a careful future." Caitlyn understood the weight of those words. She had no intention of spoiling what had healed her. If anything, she wanted to protect it even more fiercely. The permits came slowly, one at a time, over a year. She received them in stages: approval to restore and maintain the original cabin, authorization to build additional small structures with limited footprint, permission to host a specific number of visitors during non-winter months. Each letter felt like a victory, not because of what it granted her, but because it confirmed that her life here was no longer a temporary refuge. It was becoming something intentional. With legal approval secured, she turned to the work of construction. The cabin had taught her the basics of rugged repair, but building entirely new structures required more planning. She sketched designs carefully, favoring simplicity and durability. Each additional dwelling would be modest, nothing more than a small living space with a bed, a wood stove, and room for a few personal belongings. She wanted the structures to blend into the landscape, to feel like they belonged rather than intruded. Atlas stayed close during every phase of construction, sometimes lying in the shade watching her work, other times trotting alongside her as she hauled lumber or cleared brush. He had aged over the seasons, the beginnings of silver appearing around his muzzle, but his eyes remained bright and attentive. He seemed to understand that the clearing was becoming more than a shelter. It was becoming a home for others too. As she built the first cabin, she documented each step, the angle of the foundation, the thickness of the insulation, the way she reinforced the roof to withstand heavy snowfall. It wasn't just for herself. She imagined teaching these skills to the people who would come for her programs. She imagined handing them tools, showing them how to split wood, how to track weather patterns, how to recognize the difference between a heavy storm and a passing squall. Practical knowledge had saved her, and she believed it could save others, not from physical danger necessarily, but from the emotional weight of disconnect that seemed to plague so many. By midsummer, the first small retreat cabin stood proudly to one side of the clearing. The structure was simple but solid, with a gently sloped roof, a single thick door, and a small window placed to catch the morning light. Standing before it, she felt something stir inside her, a feeling she had once associated with completing a major project in her design studio, but deeper, richer, grounded in authenticity rather than ego. This was not a creation meant to impress. It was meant to serve. She invited two friends she had made in town, people who had shown interest in her project to help with the final touches. Together they sanded the interior walls, placed a handmade wooden bed frame against the far wall, and installed a small shelf for guests to place their belongings. The collaboration felt different from teamwork in her former career. There was no hierarchy here, no competition or scrutiny, only a shared sense of purpose. When word began to spread that a retreat in the mountains was taking shape, one unlike the commercialized, curated escapes that filled glossy brochures, Caitlyn found herself receiving messages from strangers. Some were people she had met briefly during her trips to town, others had heard from the hikers she'd spoken with, and still others found her through chains of conversation she couldn't trace. Their messages carried similar themes: exhaustion, uncertainty, longing for quiet. Many wrote that they didn't want luxury or distraction. They wanted something real. She realized then just how universal her own unraveling had been. She was not an anomaly. She was part of a larger truth that many people were quietly living. By the time the first group arrived for a 2-week retreat, the clearing had transformed into a small, purposeful space. The original cabin served as the central gathering area, while the newly built structures offered private quarters for participants. A simple fire pit sat in the heart of the clearing, ringed by stones she had collected throughout the forest. Wildflowers grew at the edges, where she had been careful not to disrupt the natural landscape. Everything felt deliberate. The group consisted of 8 individuals, each carrying their own stories. A lawyer from Chicago, worn thin by corporate pressure, a teacher from Phoenix, fresh from a difficult divorce, a young couple from Oregon contemplating a shift to off-grid living. Others were seeking something they couldn't fully articulate. They arrived with hesitance, stepping out of their vehicles and looking around with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Caitlyn greeted them quietly, offering no grand speeches or elaborate introductions. Instead, she showed them to their cabins, pointed out the stove, the firewood shed, the creek where they could gather water. She encouraged them to settle in, to walk the clearing, to breathe deeply. Atlas trotted between them, offering gentle nudges and warm glances, demonstrating instinctively which visitors needed reassurance and which needed space. The first few days were awkward. People were not used to silence, nor to the absence of digital noise. Phones stayed uncharged, conversations were hesitant, and several participants admitted feeling restless without their usual routines. But as the days passed, something began to shift. They worked together on tasks splitting wood, repairing a section of the original cabin, learning to build small cook fires, and the physicality of the work calmed them. Evenings around the fire became quiet but meaningful, with people sharing parts of their stories without needing to explain everything. The air felt lighter. Caitlyn watched this transformation with a mixture of humility and wonder. She had expected the retreat to help others, but she hadn't anticipated how much it would help her as well. She felt grounded in a way she'd never been in her former life, connected not only to the land, but to the people who came seeking the same sense of belonging she had once thought she would never find again. When the first group left, they hugged her with genuine gratitude, promising to stay in touch. A few wrote letters afterward, describing how their time in the mountains had reshaped their priorities or helped them make difficult decisions. One person said she had cried for the first time in years, not from sadness, but from relief. Another said the retreat had reminded him that life didn't need to be conquered, it needed to be lived. As summer drifted toward autumn, more groups came. Caitlyn refined her programs, blending practical lessons with quiet reflection. She invited a local herbalist to teach about native plants. A retired carpenter came for a weekend to demonstrate joinery techniques. The community around the retreat grew naturally, unforced, like the forest itself. Through it all, Atlas remained her closest companion. He greeted every visitor, supervised every construction project, and lay beside the fire during every evening gathering. Caitlyn sometimes wondered if the retreat would be the same without him. She doubted it. He had become part of the soul of the place. By the time her 4th year in the mountains arrived, the retreat was no longer an idea or a project. It was a living, breathing reality. She woke each morning with a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with reputation or competition. Her cabin felt more like home than any place she had lived before. The forest no longer felt foreign or threatening. It felt protective. One crisp September morning, she stepped onto the porch with her coffee, watching as mist drifted across the meadow. The leaves were beginning to turn, their edges tinged with yellow and ochre. Atlas stood beside her, his coat ruffled by the cool breeze, his eyes soft and alert. She could hear the distant calls of birds waking, the rustle of small animals in the brush, the quiet heartbeat of the forest. She thought of the people arriving later that day, the newest group seeking a pause from the rushing world below. She thought of the years she had spent here, the brutal winter, the relentless storms, the moments of loneliness, the unexpected triumphs. She thought of the woman she had been when she first arrived in the clearing, fragile and hollowed by loss, desperate for a place to disappear. And she realized she had found something she hadn't even known she was searching for. A way back to herself. Perhaps it was true that sometimes people had to lose everything to understand what they truly needed. She had lost her business, her marriage, her home, her identity. In their place, she had found clarity, resilience, a sense of connection to something greater than success or failure. She had found work that nourished her spirit instead of draining it, and she had found a home, not in the sense of a building or a city, but in the quiet acceptance that life did not need to be perfect to be meaningful. Atlas nudged her hand, urging her back inside before the morning grew cold. She smiled and scratched behind his ears, the simple gesture filled with years of shared trust. Together they stepped into the cabin, preparing for another day in the life they had built, a life shaped not by expectation, but by choice. The forest waited outside, timeless and patient. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, Caitlyn felt completely, undeniably where she belonged. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure to check out the next videos. They're already waiting for you. Share this video with someone who might need it today. Thanks for watching.